From convicts sentenced to the firing squad to those who received lethal injections, today we bring you a detailed look at all prisoners executed in March 2025 in the U.S., including their last meals and final words. Case number 1, Wendell Gryom. We begin with the case of Wendell Arden Gryom, who spent 17 years on death row and soon became a name etched into Oklahoma's long and troubled history with capital punishment. He was known to prison staff as quiet, reclusive, and often withdrawn. By the time he was in his 50s, he had become a man of few words and long stares. But back in 2005, his name was tied to a crime that sent shockwaves through a small community and changed a family forever. Gryom had already been in and out of prison, carrying a lengthy rap sheet and a troubled history that began almost at birth. Documented brain injuries, a childhood riddled with trauma, and years of substance abuse had shaped a volatile adult life. On parole at the time, he picked up a hitchhiker named Jesse Johns. The two had never met before, but within hours, they were making plans to rob someone. Anyone. They ended up choosing a quiet home near Watonga, Oklahoma, where Drew Koff lived with her husband, her 2 kids, and a visiting friend, Amber Matthews. The break-in was violent and quick. Gryom shot Drew Koff 3 times, and while she miraculously survived, Amber Matthews, just 23, didn't. She was shielding a baby when she was shot on the back of the head. Gryom then stood over her and fired a second shot into her forehead. Jesse Johns, the accomplice, who is now serving life without parole, would later testify that Gryom laughed during the shooting. Courtroom testimony painted a chilling picture. Prosecutors called the crime brutal and pointless, while the defense leaned on Grysom's lifelong mental health issues and unstable upbringing. Appeals followed. One even made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that he was intoxicated during the crime and could not form proper intent, but none of it changed the outcome. The Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board voted 4-1 against clemency in February 2025. On March 20th, 2025, at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, the state carried out the sentence. Grysom's final hours were spent quietly. His last meal was a medium-thick crust Canadian bacon supreme pizza, a pint of vanilla ice cream, and a pint of Coca-Cola. Before the drugs were administered, Gryom made a final statement. It was long, emotional, and directed toward Amber Matthews' family. He said, "I do sincerely regret what I've done, not only because it put me here, but because I can't even imagine the pain I caused." He apologized repeatedly and asked for forgiveness, not just for himself, but for everyone involved.
Yeah, he said, "I want you guys to forgive me, not for me, but forgive me for you guys so you can move on." That gave me a peace of mind and some healing.
Witnesses said the process was swift. Within minutes, he was gone. In that small execution chamber were 6 members of his family, and across from them, 26 relatives and friends of the victims, silent, tearful, and waiting for a kind of closure that may never truly come. And while Gryom was executed by lethal injection, this next convict faced a harsher, more violent method, one that matched the brutality of his crimes. Case number 2, Brad Keith Sigman. Brad Keith Sigman spent 23 years on death row for a crime so brutal it still chills the South Carolina community where it happened. His execution in March 2025 closed a grim chapter that began one violent night in 2001, a night that left 2 people dead, a daughter forever scarred, and a manhunt that gripped the nation. After his ex-girlfriend, Barbara Armstrong, ended their 3-year relationship and moved back in with her parents, Sigman, who wouldn't accept it, began stalking her and plotting revenge. Following a night of drinking and using crack cocaine with a friend, he broke into Lark's home in Taylor, South Carolina. While Barbara was away, armed with a baseball bat, Sigman bludgeoned her parents, David, age 62, and Gladys, age 55. The attack was vicious. Autopsies would later reveal that both victims suffered multiple blows to the head, severe skull fractures, and extensive brain trauma. Gladys was found collapsed on the floor, clutching a telephone she had tried to use to call for help. David never made it that far. The scene was described by investigators as one of the most violent they had ever encountered in a domestic setting. Nothing of value was taken. Sigman had come not to steal, but to punish. Sigman then stole David's handgun and waited for Barbara to return. When she arrived, he forced her at gunpoint into a Honda Passport, intending to flee with her to North Carolina. During the drive, Barbara managed to jump from the moving vehicle, and she fled. Sigman shot at her, striking her in the foot, but she survived. A nationwide manhunt lasted 11 days before authorities captured Sigman in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. He was extradited to South Carolina, where he was convicted of 2 counts of murder, first-degree burglary, and kidnapping before being given the death sentence. At sentencing, Sigman reportedly locked eyes with Barbara. Despite the trauma he caused, she later voiced her opposition to the execution, stating through her attorney that life imprisonment would have been a more fitting punishment than state-sanctioned killing. Sigman requested 3 buckets of Kentucky Fried Chicken to share with fellow death row inmates, but the request was denied. Instead, his last meal consisted of fried chicken, baked beans, mashed potatoes with gravy, biscuit, cheesecake, and sweet tea. His final words, delivered through his attorney, condemned the death penalty as a contradiction of Christian faith. Why do we still live by an eye for an eye when the New Testament calls us to turn the other cheek? He asked, referencing Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 39, and Romans chapter 6, verse 14. He urged lawmakers to abolish capital punishment. The execution marks South Carolina's first use of a firing squad since 2023. Sigman was strapped into a reinforced metal chair at 6:03 p.m., a hood placed over his head, and a white paper target taped over his heart. 3 corrections officers concealed behind a wall 15 feet away simultaneously fired a .308 caliber Winchester tap urban rounds. The bullets, designed to fragment on impact, cause instant cardiac destruction. He was pronounced dead at 6:08 p.m. The state spent approximately $53,000 retrofitting the chamber with bulletproof glass, a blood catch basin, and soundproofing to shield the identities of the shooters, protected under a 2023 anonymity law. Though she did not attend the execution, Rebecca Barbara shared through her lawyer that Sigman's death brought no closure, only a painful reminder of the permanent void left by her parents' murder. But if Sigman's tragic case gave you mixed feelings, just wait until you hear about this next one. Case number 3, Jesse Hoffman. Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. was born in Louisiana on September 1st, 1978. By the time he was in his late teens, he had already developed a troubling pattern of violence and instability. But it was what he did at age 18 that would haunt an entire state for decades. On the night of November 26, 1996, Hoffman abducted 28-year-old Molly Elliott, an advertising executive from a parking garage in New Orleans. It was the day before Thanksgiving. He approached Molly at gunpoint. She was returning to her car after work. Forcing her into the vehicle, he drove her to a nearby ATM where she was made to withdraw $200. Surveillance footage from the ATM showed Molly's clear distress as she carried out his demands, her last moments seen by the public. Hoffman then took her across parish lines to a remote wooded area in St. Tammany Parish. There he sexually assaulted her and afterward shot her in the head, execution style. He left her body nude and discarded it on a deserted dock. It was discovered 2 days later by a duck hunter. The crime was brutal and cold. There was no sign of panic or second thoughts. When he was finally caught, Hoffman confessed, though at trial his defense claimed the gun had gone off accidentally during a struggle. The jury didn't buy it. With DNA evidence, the ATM footage, and his own admission, Jesse Hoffman was convicted of first-degree murder on September 11, 1998. Legal appeals stretched over the next 25 years. At the heart of many of them was Hoffman's challenge to Louisiana's new method of execution, nitrogen hypoxia. His lawyers argued that as a practicing Buddhist, this form of execution violated his religious beliefs. And they also called it cruel and unusual. In March of 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court allowed the execution to move forward by a narrow 5-4 decision. Hoffman declined a last meal and offered no final words. He was strapped into place and fitted with a full face mask as nitrogen gas was administered. Witnesses described his final moments as quiet but disturbing. His fists tightened, his body twitched, his breathing slowed. 19 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. It was Louisiana's first execution since 2010. Governor Jeff Landry said justice had finally been served. Molly Elliott's husband, Andy, gave a measured response. He had never pushed for Hoffman's death, but admitted it might bring some form of closure, at least to the legal process. For him, the most important chapter had closed the moment Molly was taken. Everything after that had just been a slow, painful epilogue. Jesse Hoffman's execution was Louisiana's first in over a decade, and it raised serious questions about justice, cruelty, and closure. But while Hoffman's fought to delay his death, this next man did the exact opposite. In fact, he demanded it. Case number 4, Aaron Gunz. Aaron Brian Gunz spent more than 2 decades on Arizona's death row for a crime he never denied committing, for an execution he actively demanded. His lethal injection on March 19, 2025, marked Arizona's first execution under a Democratic governor in nearly a decade, closing one of the most unusual capital punishment cases in state history. But beyond the headlines about his strange eagerness to die lay a brutal crime that destroyed multiple lives. The story began in 2002 in the desert outside Mesa, where Ted Price, a 37-year-old radiology student and father of 3, met a horrifying end. Price had recently moved from Utah to rebuild his life after a divorce, temporarily living with his ex-wife, who happened to be Gunz's new girlfriend. What followed wasn't a crime of passion, but a cold, calculated execution. Gunz lured Price into the desert under false pretenses, forced him to kneel in the dirt, and shot him twice in the back of the head with a .22 caliber pistol. The crime scene photos shown at trial revealed Price's hands were still bound behind his back with speaker wire when his body was discovered. Gunz showed no remorse from the beginning. In 2007, he stunned the courtroom by pleading guilty to first-degree murder, then taunted prosecutors by saying they'd need a Ouija board to find the murder weapon. At sentencing, he told Price's weeping family members they were wasting their time asking for mercy. The judge called it one of the most remorseless displays he had ever seen before imposing the death penalty. What made Gunz's case extraordinary was what happened next. While most death row inmates fight for every appeal, Gunz did the opposite. He fired his attorney, waived all appeals, and for years bombarded courts with handwritten motions demanding his own execution. "Get this over with," he wrote in one filing. "The victim's family has waited long enough." His relentless campaign put Arizona's justice system in an awkward position. How to handle an inmate who wanted to die when the state itself had paused executions over concerns about lethal injection drugs. The execution finally came at 10 a.m. in Florence's death chamber. Gunz, his arms heavily tattooed with skulls and the words RIP visible beneath the restraint straps, declined to make a final statement, just shaking his head when asked for last words. His final meal request was a double Western burger, spicy gyros, onion rings, and baklava. Simple, yet telling of his acceptance of the situation. Witnesses noted the faint smell of baklava in the room from his last meal as the pentobarbital took effect. At 10:33 a.m., after what observers called one of Arizona's smoothest executions in years, Gunz was pronounced dead. For Ted Price's family, it was a moment they'd waited 23 years to see. His sister told reporters afterward, "We never understood why he wanted this so badly, but we know Ted can finally rest." Arizona's officials emphasized the execution followed all protocols perfectly, a stark contrast to the state's troubled executions in previous years. And with Gunz's death, one of Americans' most unusual death row sagas came to an end, not with a fight, but with the eerie cooperation of the condemned man himself. While Aaron Gunz wanted his execution, this next case is a shocking story of a brutal crime and decades of waiting for justice. You won't believe how it ends. Case number 5, Edward Thomas James. Edward Thomas James was born on August 4, 1961, In Florida, after spending more than 3 decades on death row, he was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison on March 20th, 2025. His execution came nearly 30 years after he was sentenced to death for one of the most horrifying crimes in Seminole County history, the 1993 murders of 8-year-old Toni Nooner and her 65-year-old grandmother, Becky Dick. The crimes occurred on September 19, 1993 in Castleberry, Florida. At the time, James was renting a room from Becky Dick's home. On the night of the murders, after reportedly consuming up to 24 beers, gin, and LSD at a social gathering, James returned to the residence in a disturbed and intoxicated state. There he raped and strangled Toni and stabbed Betty Dick 21 times, all in front of her surviving grandchildren. He then stole Dick's jewelry and her car before fleeing the state. James drove across the country, selling stolen items along the way until his arrest in California on October 6, 1993. His capture was prompted by a viewer's tip to America's Most Wanted. During interrogation, James confessed on video and later pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, rape, and robbery.
For what I did, there's nothing I can do to even begin to make it right, or apologize or say I'm sorry. And I just soon come get me and put me out, man. Then we'll do away with it.
He requested a sentence of life in prison, but in 1995, a jury voted 11-1 to recommend the death penalty. The sentence was upheld by the Florida Supreme Court in 1996. In the years that followed, James' legal team argued that his execution should be halted due to mental and physical deterioration. They cited chronic substance abuse, head injuries, and a significant heart attack he suffered in prison in 2015. Despite these claims, Florida courts consistently ruled that James was mentally competent to face execution. Just weeks before his death, the Florida Supreme Court again denied a final appeal, ruling that his impairments did not meet the legal threshold for exemption. A last-minute stay request to U.S. Supreme Court based on the non-unanimous jury recommendation for death was denied on the day of the execution. James was executed using Florida's 3-drug lethal injection protocol, which includes a sedative, a paralytic, and a chemical that induces cardiac arrest. The procedure, initially set for 6 p.m., was unexpectedly delayed and ultimately carried out at 8:15 p.m. Witnesses reported a clinically smooth process with no visible signs of complications. James offered no final statement. His last meal was not publicly confirmed, though prison sources indicated he accepted a standard meal option rather than a specific request. His execution marked Florida's second of 2025. While victim family members chose not to speak publicly following the event, state officials stated the case's resolution brought an end to a long and painful chapter. Advocacy groups, including Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, acknowledged James's remorse and pointed to his traumatic childhood, substance use history, and efforts at rehabilitation. They described him as deeply changed during his decades behind bars, calling his execution a reminder of a justice system that prioritizes retribution over restoration.